and welcome to It Should Be News, a programme where citizen TV makers ensure that important issues underreported by mainstream media get the hearing that they deserve. I'm Eden Bokcrazion, and in today's discussion, we will be talking about anti-Semitism. To help us understand this issue, we're absolutely delighted to have with us Daniel Ben-Ami. Daniel's a London-based writer with a long-standing interest in anti-Semitism and Israel. To start with, Daniel, can you describe to us how you would define anti-Semitism or anti-Semitic activity? And can you give us a picture of where and what is happening right now?
I think anti-Semitism is really hostility towards Jews. And there are different manifestations of it. So you can measure attacks on Jewish people, or in Jewish cemeteries sometimes you have swastikas daubed on the cemeteries. But I think much more the way it manifests itself nowadays is more particularly the idea that Jews are somehow all-powerful. And you can see that in the recent conflict over Gaza, those kind of ideas, although they existed before the conflict, they really came to the fore in the discussion over Gaza and the conflict over Gaza.
Can you give us some examples of what's been happening in 2014?
Well, there are quite a lot of examples of Jewish people being attacked, of synagogues being attacked, of supermarkets taking kosher food off their shelves, Jewish film festivals not being allowed to use certain venues. So there's lots of examples like that. But I think underlying that is the idea that Jews are this kind of powerful, shadowy presence, and somehow they're to blame for a lot of the problems in society.
And why do you think this is happening?
Well, I think it's quite a complicated phenomenon, but I think most recently, if you look at it in relation to the conflict in Gaza, I mean, it might seem peculiar, but it's really Jews standing up for themselves, because we live in an era where people are supposed to behave as victims. You know, they're just supposed to lie down and let themselves be beaten up, or they're supposed to allow the Western powers to come and rescue them if they live in poorer countries. And yet you see Israel behaving in quite a kind of aggressive, militaristic fashion. But the people who are objecting, they're not objecting because they're pacifists, and they're not objecting because they're against military intervention against poorer countries. They just don't like anyone at all who doesn't play the victim and doesn't stand up for themselves. So I think that's the kind of most immediate trigger for the recent wave of anti-Semitism in relation to the Gaza conflict.
Some say anti-Semitism has actually been exaggerated to excuse Israel's attacks on Gaza. What do you make of this?
I think sometimes that has been true historically, but I think the opposite is true now. I think, if anything, people are playing down the problem of anti-Semitism. They're just saying, well, you know, we're not anti-Semites, we're just complaining about what the Israeli government and the Israeli army is doing in Gaza, and it's nothing to do with anti-Semitism. But I think that is really disingenuous, because when you look at the discussion, the themes I mentioned before about Israel being a shadowy presence, in manipulating David Cameron in Britain and manipulating America and having so much power around the world, that's very much to the fore in those discussions. And people may deny that, but I think that's classic anti-Semitism.
Clearly you see anti-Semitism as an issue that needs to take a higher priority. Can you explain why? Because
I don't think it's recognised, and because I think it's dangerous in many ways. I mean, I think it's bad for Jewish people, and I think that the mass of the population should stand up. If one section of society is under attack, then I think it's quite right that other people in society stand up against those attacks. And also I think it feeds into this broader conspiratorial climate, which is very negative. So in other words, rather than people think about the problems that they're suffering and what's really going on, they just think there's this giant shadowy conspiracy. And I think that kind of idea just leads people down all sorts of blind alleys, which are not useful at all.
How would you respond to people who argue that anti-Semitism is an understandable reaction to Israel's attacks on Gaza, given that they've been responsible for devastating many people's lives?
Well, I think if you're talking about people in the West and how they're responding, I think if you look at it objectively, it's a very peculiar reaction, and it certainly doesn't justify anti-Semitism, because there's all sorts of very terrible conflicts going on in the world, and yet so many people in the West now, and often people with no personal connection, get really het up in particular about Israel. You know, not about the Ukraine, not about Iraq or Syria, which in many ways are much larger scale conflicts, So I think you have to ask, well, what is going on? Why are people taking it almost as a personal attack on themselves? Why are they getting so het up about it? I think that's an interesting thing to think about.
Others argue that they're not anti-Semitic, they're anti-Zionist. Can you explain what Zionism is and whether the distinction stands as relevant today?
Well, they are two different things, but they certainly can overlap. I mean, I would really define Zionism as a belief that a Jewish state is a solution to the question of anti-Semitism. In other words, Jews need not just to live in Israel, but they need a state that they control in Israel in order to tackle the problem of anti-Semitism. That's really was the impetus from the late 19th century for Israel to later on come into existence. And anti-Semitism, as I said before, is really hostility towards the Jewish people. So it certainly is possible to be one without the other. I mean, there's been a big tradition, including Jewish anti-Zionists who don't see Israel as a solution to anti-Semitism and to the Jewish question. But I think what's happened over the last few years is that they've become more and more fused. So more and more people are just using criticisms of Israel as a coded way of attacking Jewish people. Also Jews being terrible to Christian babies and even eating Christian babies. That was a kind of classic libel against the Jewish people. So I think although the things are different and historically have sometimes been separate, in the recent period they've really become very muddled and quite difficult to separate.
Do you think anti-Semitism has been something that's lingered on under the surface since the Holocaust, or is there something new about it that's attracting younger generations to latch onto it?
I think there's something new. I mean, anti-Semitism is a difficult phenomenon to discuss historically because you can find all sorts of historical examples, and I would argue that there's usually different dynamics at different times. But I think it's really the last few years where you can see a particular dynamic, which, as I've said, I think relates partly to the kind of victim culture thing. So Israel is seen as a particularly aggressive militaristic power, but also to a growing sense of conspiracy and conspiracy theories. In other words, in general, there's this view in society that nothing is under our control, we're controlled by this, shadowy conspiracy. And when you have, in general, conspiracy theories becoming stronger and stronger, it doesn't take that much for them to be linked to Jews and to classic anti-Semitic themes.
You've mentioned a sort of victim culture evolving recently. Do you think that Jews who want protection against anti-Semitism are also under this culture?
Well, I think, first of all, within Israeli society, so I'm not talking here about Western Jews outside Israel, there is actually quite a strong victim culture, but that isn't really understood in the Western discussion. I mean, Israelis are just seen as these kind of aggressive racists who want to attack the Palestinians. In fact, again, I think something different is happening now if you look at the Western discussion. It's more, because when people say, well, we're not anti-Semitic, we're anti-Zionist, I think what they're really saying is that Jews and Israelis in particular should behave more like victims. So that is, I think, to me, that is very much the thrust of the discussion. Why are the Israelis standing up for themselves and using force to stand up for themselves? Why don't they just behave like victims in the past? So it's okay if Jews are victims. If Jews behave like victims, as they have been historically, and as everyone else, in the view of these critics, should, then it would be okay. But why aren't they behaving like victims? So to me, that seems very much the thrust of the discussion.
What about the difference in might between Israel and Gaza? Israel seemed to have mass weapons up to their teeth, whereas Gaza seemed to have these, homemade weapons. Are people right in suggesting that this is an unfair fight?
Well, it's certainly true that the Israeli army is much more powerful than the Hamas military forces, although Israel's military strength is often exaggerated. But I think that's a narrow way to look at it. I mean, for a start, and this is really as a secondary point, but Hamas gets support from Qatar and Turkey. It does get support from other players in the Middle East. But much more important than that, if you look at things in broader terms, so you don't focus very narrowly on the Gaza conflict, but look more generally at the Middle East and the world as a whole, then you see Israel is really a minnow compared to the Western powers, compared to America and Britain and France. And they're the ones who are really very much calling the shots in the Middle East, not Israel. Israel may be strong compared to Gaza, because Gaza is a tiny enclave of Palestinians, but in fact it's quite weak in terms of the Middle East, let alone in global terms. It's a real minnow compared to America and France and Britain and so on.
Do you think Israel is justified in bombing Gaza?
I don't think Israel should be bombing Gaza. I'm against Israel bombing Gaza, but I think you need to understand its motivation. And I think from an Israeli perspective, it's motivated not by a kind of aggressive racism, which is how it's understood very often in the West, but by a kind of fear. Because the fear is, oh my God, these Palestinians are going to kill us, they're trying to get rid of us, they're trying to push us into the sea, and so on. And I think this fear is really overdone and exaggerated, but the thing is the Western double standards, in other words, criticising Israel for doing things which the West does itself and which lots of other people do, that exacerbates the fear, this sense of fear in Israeli society, and I would argue makes matters a lot worse. So there is a connection between the way people criticise Israel and Israel's what you could call reckless behaviour in relation to Gaza.
Don't you think Palestinians have a right to fight for their rights, for land that's been taken from them, or even for their own sovereignty? Yeah,
although I don't think that the Palestinians as a whole are fighting at the moment. I mean, I think what you've had, it's certainly very clear in the West Bank that the Palestinians have, 20 years ago, signed an agreement where they accept the settlements. The Palestinian leadership tried to play that down, but this is written in paper. They've kind of accepted it and given up fighting. And even in relation to Gaza, I think it's not so much motivated by a drive for Palestinian freedom. I think genuine Palestinian freedom would be a very good thing. But I think a lot of the rocket fire is motivated by, for example, getting the West to intervene to put pressure on Israel, which is not to say the Palestinians don't suffer from a denial of rights, because they do. But I don't think you could say there's any real Palestinian freedom struggle at the moment.
Would you say that Hamas are anti-Semitic?
Well, I think certainly if you look at their charter, they do talk in anti-Semitic terms in their charter. You've got to be careful because they're in a different position. They are, at least up to a point, representing Palestinians in Gaza who are at the brunt of Israeli attacks. So you can understand why a lot of Palestinians in Gaza, certainly not all of them, but a lot of Palestinians in Gaza do support Hamas. But I'd be much more harsh on Westerners who romanticise Hamas and glorify Hamas and say how great it is. The Western commentators and critics have no excuse, really. They're not the people at the brunt of these kinds of attacks.
The protests over Gaza have been huge, yet there have been little protests, or not to the same scale, surrounding, the recent slaughters in the Ukraine, Western intervention in Afghanistan. Why do you think this is?
Well, I think that's a very important point. I think you have to ask, why is that the case? Because I think that if a Martian came down and looked at all these different conflicts, they'd probably say, well, why is it that so much attention is being put on Israel rather than the Ukraine or lots of other conflicts going on? And I think it relates to some of the themes that I've spoken to before. It's kind of, Jews are meant to be the ultimate victims, but in the Israeli case they seem to be fighting, and people standing up and fighting for themselves is in today's peculiar conditions seen as a bad thing. It feeds into this idea of shadowy Jews manipulating the world and being in control of what's happening in the world. I think those are the kind of factors that explain it. But not enough people are asking that question. Why put so much attention on Israel and the Palestinians? It certainly is a terrible conflict, but there are lots of other terrible conflicts out there, and arguably more terrible, at least if you measure them by the number of people who are being slaughtered.
Has the media played a role in promoting the anti-Semitism that's going on now?
I think they'd probably be horrified that someone would say that, and they deny it, but I think there is an element of that. Maybe to give one example, which is different from the Palestinian conflict, but there's this guy who wrote a book about Goldman Sachs, the American investment bank, a few years ago, where he talked about Goldman Sachs, I forget the exact phrase, but sucking the blood funnel of humanity. It's this really kind of gory, metaphor he used about Goldman Sachs, this investment bank, sucking the blood out of American society and the American economy. And that's classic anti-Semitic imagery. In fact, but I reviewed a book this guy had written, and I checked it's classic, even in Mein Kampf, literally, Hitler uses very similar imagery of Jewish bankers sucking the blood out of German society in the 1930s. And yet this guy, he wasn't just some one journalist. There were lots of people who were saying, "Oh, this is brilliant, brilliant, really clever imagery. We think this is fantastic," and not seeing what was in fact very, very blatant anti-Semitism, classic anti-Semitic imagery.
What do you think is the solution for the Israel and Gaza conflict?
First of all, I think it's up to people in the region to have a solution. It's not really up to me or you or people outside the region. But if I had to bet, I'd say that it will, if it does come about, it'll probably come about as some kind of regional settlement. In other words, it probably won't just involve Israel and the Palestinians, but probably the surrounding countries. And when you think about it, I mean, people now really focus on Israel and the Palestinians, but in fact, that whole part of the Middle East, the Mashrek, the kind of eastern part of the Middle East, including Lebanon and Syria and Iraq, is completely unravelling at the moment, which is a really bad thing, a real problem, and lots of people are being killed. But I think a solution, if it does come, and I hope it does, will probably come on a more regional level rather than just focused on Israel and the Palestinians.
Some argue Islamophobia is a big problem at the moment, as well as anti-Semitism. Aren't they both a problem at the moment?
I don't think I'd use the term Islamophobia. I mean, I think it's certainly true that there is, in many places, hostility to people of Muslim origin or coming from Islamic countries. There is certainly a degree of hostility in lots of different places in Europe. It's not in competition with anti-Semitism. In that sense, I think people who see themselves as humanists should stand up against all forms of discrimination. I think it is true that, at least on the level of lip service, people recognise that hostility to Muslims or people of Muslim origin is a problem. So David Cameron will say that Muslims shouldn't be targeted for what Islamic terrorists do in the Middle East, for example. Whereas in relation to the Jewish question, I think anti-Semitism isn't really recognised at the moment. It's usually denied that it's a significant problem, or it's just seen as a problem. It might be seen as a problem, but just very much on the margins, not a problem in mainstream society.
Do you see something as horrific as the Holocaust as something that can happen again?
Well, I certainly think that theoretically terrible things could happen again. I mean, it wouldn't be exactly the Holocaust, but I don't think we can really think like that. I think we've just got to react to problems as we see them today. And if particular groups are being attacked and singled out and victimised, then we need to stand up against that.
When writing about the Holocaust, some have criticised the "Never Again" slogan because it assumes that anyone is capable of these atrocities. What do you make of this?
Yeah, I think the "Never Again" slogan is problematic for several reasons. I think for a start, it assumes that things might happen again in exactly the same way that they happened in the past. You get a kind of replay of the Holocaust. And although, as I've said, I think terrible things could theoretically happen in the future, I don't think that they happen in exactly the same way. But also, I think there's a misunderstanding of the Holocaust anyway. We probably don't have time to discuss it, but it's often understood as, Hitler was really evil and the German people went really crazy and they just started killing Jews, and it's understood in a very crass kind of way. Whereas in fact it has to be understood in the context of a big struggle that took place in Europe in the earlier part of the 20th century, and the kind of radical progressive forces being defeated, but not taking racism and discrimination seriously enough. That's one reason why they were defeated. So there isn't really a serious historical discussion about what happened. It's just seen as a kind of nasty narrative of Hitler and crazy Germans, and I think that's another problem with the whole "never again" conception of things.
And what's the best way to challenge anti-Semitism, do you think?
Ultimately, I think we need to stand up against what are usually very clear manifestations of anti-Semitism. So if people talk about Jews being part of this huge conspiracy, manipulating the whole world, if they talk about Jews manipulating Christian or non-Jewish babies, if they talk about the all-powerful Jews and so on, we just need to say, look, this is not criticising Israel. This is anti-Semitism, this is discrimination, this is dangerous for lots of reasons. And we have to call it for what it is and stand up against it.
Thank you so much, Daniel. That's been really helpful. I'm afraid that's all we have time for today, but if there's an issue that you think should be news, email us.